Hi friends and welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, hello! My name's George Agenbar and I'm a UK music producer. Today we're going to be talking about how to approach a mix, how I like to organise mixes, gain staging and some of the processes I like to follow. This is really a starting point. We're all learning and getting better with each mix we do. So hopefully this video will give you a strong foundation to go on and produce some great mixes.
And things will never be the same when I hear your name since you kissed me in the rain.
This video is aimed at home producers, aspiring home producers and singer-songwriters who might want to record and edit some demos, so hopefully you'll all find it very useful. The first thing we need to do is import our stems if we haven't recorded them ourselves, so that we actually have something to work with. So when you open Logic, we should all be familiar with this screen, and it allows us to choose what kind of file we want to import into our Logic project. And stems we get sent are audio files. So you want to make sure we click on audio and press create. Then you can go to File, Import, Audio File, and choose the stem you want to import. You can also then choose whether you want the stems to decide the tempo information of the project, which I normally do. Then choose whether you want to import the markers the stems may include, which will appear up here and normally let you know which part of the song you're at. And then you have your stem. Alternatively, you can use the keyboard shortcut Command, Shift and I, which will bring up the same screen and you'll have to go through the same process. To import multiple stems, you can simply find all your stems in your Finder, select them all and drag them into your project. You then click Create New Tracks and OK, and it will start adding your audio files. This is a really handy trick and saves a lot of time. For about the first year, I spent ages importing my tracks one by one, and so I really wish I knew this trick before. There are different qualities and formats of audio stems that you can ask for and that you can be sent, and some are definitely preferable. We should always be asking for consolidated stems. And by this, I mean that the audio track starts from the beginning of the song, not just where the instrument comes in. And this is really important because it means we won't spend ages and ages lining up all the tracks, making sure everything's in time, and we actually have more time to do mixing. I'll leave a link in the description about consolidating stems in different DAWs. Where you can, you should be asking for tracks without EQ and effects already applied to them, so that you've got a blank canvas to work from effectively. But it's normally okay to ask for vocal tracks that have already been tuned. Stems in a WAV format are preferable because they're uncompressed files, so the sound of your audio won't be changed. This can be at a sample rate of either 44.1 kHz or 48 kHz. There isn't a huge audible difference between the two, so either is okay. MP3 files are also workable. They are compressed though, so it's important to bear in mind that anything above 18 kHz in your frequency spectrum is likely to be cut off. With MP3 files, you should be looking at a sample rate of around 320 kilobytes per second, although 256 would be okay as well. Okay, so now I've imported all of my stems. Everyone has a preference and an opinion on how best to organise your project. I'm going to show you the way that I've adapted to work and how I like to organise mine. The vocals always go at the top, as you can see here, and that's because they're my main concern. And also, as I listen to the mix, there are normally little tweaks I want to make to the vocals, so by putting them at the top, they're easily accessible and I know exactly where they are, and I can go and make those tweaks very quickly. I then tend to put any backing vocals and doubles underneath my main vocal. My drums go underneath my vocals, and then I go to my basses, my synths, and all the extra percussion. And this project had quite a few tracks, so to make my job easier, I've colour-coded to visually separate different elements, such as vocals, which are blue, drums, which are pink, bass, which are yellow, synths, which are orange, and so on. It's also really useful to ask the artist and to import a reference track for your mix. This ensures that you have a really clear and easy comparison to compare your mix to, and make sure that you stay on the right track. Reference tracks can be songs in the same vein as your mix, they can be demos of the songs, they can be live performances of the songs, just anything so that you make sure that your ideas and your artist's ideas are aligned. Gain staging in the recording process ensures that your tracks have a healthy noise to signal ratio. In the mixing process, we gain stage mainly to equalise the volumes of all our tracks so they're easier to manipulate with the faders. This is important as the volume faders are logarithmic. This means that when the faders are around 0, it's easier to manipulate and make tiny adjustments. When it's at the bottom of the fader, it's just so hard to be accurate. So when we're mixing, we want it around 0 so we can make tiny adjustments. We also gain stage to make sure that the final mix has enough headroom for mastering. Mastering is a process that happens after mixing, and among other things, it increases the volume of the track. If your final mix doesn't have any headroom, so it's already at its maximum volume, there's not much that can be done in terms of mastering. When gaining up or down your tracks, you want to aim for an average of around -18 decibels, with peaks happening at around -10 decibels. So it's really simple in Logic to gain stage, and we have two options. We can either use the track information on the left-hand side of the screen to do it, or we can use a plugin. Neither of these really make a huge difference to the sound of your mix, so it's really just personal preference. So let's focus on this synth track and gain staging that. The first thing you want to do is to loop the loudest part of your track. So we can see that around here, this is probably the biggest peak and the biggest waveform we have. So we're going to loop around that section, as we know that this is where our peaks are going to be. So if we have a look at the meter here to see the level of our instrument, we can see that that's really peaking too much. So we need to reduce the gain. So using the track information, you go up to the gain and you drag down, and you can see that the waveforms will begin to shrink. So if we begin to play that section of the track again, looking at the meter, we can see we've got a much healthier level, averaging at around -18 dBs. Using the gain plugin is basically the same principle. We go to our plugin section, down to utility and gain. This screen will pop up and you use this dial to drag down the gain of your track. And if you look at the meter, it has the same effect. However, using this gain plugin, you don't get the visual representation of the waveform shrinking as you turn down the gain, and that's personally why I prefer the first technique. Once you've gain staged, all your tracks will effectively be at the same level, which means we won't have the balance in our mix that we want. Some tracks that play higher notes may sound louder to us, and that's just due to how we perceive frequency and pitch. Higher notes sound louder. This part of the mixing process is very creative and sculpts the sound of your song. When you get a bit more experienced, you can listen to an artist's reference track and know what you need to do to the mix, or you'll have a general idea as to how you want the mix to turn out. But for those of you who are starting out, there are some general guidelines that we can follow that we'll go through. Always make sure that you take 10-minute ear breaks every hour where you just don't listen to your mix, and this is to avoid ear fatigue. And when we get ear fatigue, our ears mainly lose their sensitivity. We can't hear changes in frequencies or in volumes very well anymore. So you can find yourself making huge cuts or huge adds to EQs, which are actually damaging the sound of your mix. So go and do a bit of reading, or check your social media, or go and make a cup of tea and come back and listen with fresh ears. There have been times where I've even felt the need to stop mixing and go to sleep and wake up the next day to listen to a mix. And suddenly when you do revisit the mix, it sounds like a completely different song. So let's talk about how we can begin to balance the levels of our tracks. Okay, so with this particular mix, I'm going to start by soloing the kick drum and using it as my central instrument, so I'll build the mix around it. Now I'll add in the snare to get a nice level between the two. And I want the snare to cut through, but I don't want it quite as loud as the kick. Then the cymbals and the hi-hats come in. And again, I don't want them quite as loud, just because I don't want them to be piercing and monotonous as you listen to them throughout the song. Then I'm quickly going to solo just the main bass and the kick together to make sure that they sit well together, as these can be problematic instruments. And you can hear that they do sound quite bouncy, which is just what I want. If they didn't bounce together and they didn't work together, I'd begin to look at the compression on each and the attack and release times. I can't tell you how many times I've been really unhappy with a mix because it's just not grooving the way I want, and it's the compression on the bass that's been the problem. Now I'll add in my additional bass synths, and they're all fairly standard really. There is this bass synth which I've chosen to use, which is actually quite nasty by itself. But in the mix it adds extra grit to the chorus, so I'm just going to put it in fairly low in the mix. So this is the chorus with the synth in. And this is without. So as you can hear, it just thickens it out and just adds a bit more texture and interest. Now I'm going to put in the main synths, and I'm going to put these fairly high because it's the main body of the song. And I'm fairly confident that these are going to sit well with my main vocals because of the EQ I've done on it, which we'll discuss later on in the video. So next comes in my vocals.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I meet, everything I do.
I want these to be really obvious and in your face due to the modern pop song of the vibe, so they are going to be quite loud in the mix.
I feel so weak.
So then I'm going to add my backing vocals just to thicken the texture again, so they're not going to be too high in the mix as they're just there for effect.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I meet, everything I...
And I'm just turning down the high harmony even more because we perceive higher notes as louder, so it stands out more than the other harmonies, which I don't want.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I...
And then I'll add the extra percussion.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I meet.
Now claps are my favourite percussive instrument in pop music. There's something about their attack that for me just transforms the song and makes you want to clap along. So if in doubt, add some claps. When you're EQing, you want to make sure that all your tracks work together and have their own space. And by this, I mean that you don't want too many instruments in the same frequency range, as they will sound like they're battling each other and muddy up your mix. So an example of this would be your kick drum and your bass both have frequency overlaps, so you want to make sure that you carve out a space for each. When you solo tracks, they may sound awful individually, but in the mix they sound good and work together. So always make sure that you make EQ changes in the mix and not in isolation. I personally like to choose the most important part of my mix and EQ the mix around that track. So as this is a pop song, I'd prioritise the vocals and EQ the mix around the vocals. In a rock song, I may prioritise the guitars. In a dance song, I may prioritise the bass, and so on. This is a really variable process as it is completely dependent upon which instruments you have in your mix. General instruments that tend to have the same frequencies to watch out for would be kick drums and basses, synths, pianos, guitars and vocals, and sometimes hi-hats with percussions such as things like shakers. So let's have a look at the EQ on my main bass instrument. Here I've done a low cut to around 90 Hz, which will have cleared a space or an area for the lows of my kick drum to sit, so the instruments will be working together, not against each other. So if we solo just the kick and bass together, and we turn off the bass EQ, let's have a listen to them. You can hear the low end sounds quite muddy, so now let's turn on the EQ. So you can hear that's cleared it up so much more and they gel a lot better together. Next, let's have a look at my main synth instrument to see how I've made that sit with the vocals. As you can see, I have taken out a really large range of the mid frequencies, from around 400 to 4 kHz, which leaves my vocals plenty of room to sit. I haven't cut out these frequencies completely, there will still be some in there, so the synth will still have some body, but it just won't be competing with my vocals. And I've applied the same principle to my backing vocals and harmonies here, which may sound a bit odd as I am cutting out the main range of the vocals, but I want them to sit around the main vocal and not on top of it. So let's have a listen to the backing vocals in the mix without their EQ.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I meet.
And now with their EQ.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I meet.
It just makes the mix so much clearer and the main vocal a lot more central. And that's why it's important to take the time to carve out spaces for certain instruments. The last thing I do is the panning of my tracks. And this is when we listen to a mix in stereo, we can hear which instruments are on which side of the speakers. The reason I do this last is because not everyone listens to music in stereo all the time. For example, some mobile phones only play in mono. So I want to make sure that I have a really good mono mix before I put it into stereo. When you pan and mix tracks in stereo and then put them into mono, the panned instruments will sound quieter in mono and your balance will change. So if you are really going to go very creative and very extreme with panning, I'd really recommend you consider making a mono and a stereo mix. This is an opportunity to be really creative with your panning and make your tracks sound very experimental. For example, if you listen to Revolver by the Beatles, you can hear that on some tracks the entire drum kit's been panned to the right hand side, which gives a really interesting stereo image. As with EQ, if you're starting out, there are some guidelines that you can follow with panning, such as you should keep your main vocals in the centre along with your bass and kick drum. This is because these three elements are the backbones of most mixes, so should quite literally be central. But also, we aren't good at perceiving directionality of low frequencies, so there really isn't too much benefit to gain from panning the lower frequencies. When I tend to pan, I like to visualise the instruments in my mix being played live and where they would be standing in the band, so to speak. So the kick drum normally stays in the middle, the snare off to the right a bit, the hi-hat even further off to the right, and the cymbals to the left to balance out the hi-hat cymbal a bit more. I leave the main vocal and the main instrument in the middle, and then I balance out the rest of the instruments and play around with the positions until they sound best. And with the backing vocals, I like to pan evenly to each side. So this is the chorus of the song without any panning.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I meet.
And this is with panning.
I feel so weak, I can't sleep. I hear your voice in everyone I meet.
And as you can hear, it gives us a much more exciting stereo image. It makes our mix sound a lot wider and a lot more spacious, which is why panning is such a commonly used and great mixing technique. Panning can also really help with the build-up of a song. For example, we can pan instruments and vocals even further in the chorus, making the chorus sound bigger and more exciting by giving it a bigger stereo image. And this is something that's actually quite common practice in a lot of mixes. So that is the basic mixing process, and it may seem like there's lots to do and lots to think about, but it gets easier with more experience. So I would really recommend mixing as much stuff as you possibly can. A good mixing engineer can really make or break a song, and that's why it's so important in music production. I hope that you found this helpful, and let me know what you think down in the comments and how your mix process may vary. Please do also let me know if there are any other videos you'd like to see. Make sure you hit that like button and the subscribe button with the notification bell next to it, and stay tuned for awesome new content every Wednesday. Thank you so much for coming onto my channel, and I shall see you again soon.